Welcome to our digital conversation about Corona-Capitalism, Struggles Over Nature, a conversation with Andreas Malm. It is common sense that the coronavirus pandemic is a global crisis. But if we look a bit closer into the nature of this crisis and the remedies for it, this consensus disintegrates rather quickly. In our series of digital conversations hosted by the Center for Humanities and Social Change in Berlin, we will go a bit deeper into this debate. A very warm, even if digital, welcome to our guest today, to Andreas Malm. Andreas, it's wonderful to have you.
Hi. Wonderful to be with you.
So Andreas Malm is an associate professor of human ecology from Lund University in Sweden. And he is and was a fellow at our center this year. His research primarily focuses on various aspects of the climate crisis. He is, if you don't mind, a prominent voice in what can be called a renewed ecological Marxism. His book, Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming, has been a veritable game changer in his field. And he's one of the first political theorists to come up with not only an article, but a veritable book on the Corona crisis. Very impressive, I have to say. So this book, with the title Corona, Climate, Chronic Emergency, War, Communism in the 21st Century, argues that the origin and proliferation of the plague are tightly intertwined with global capitalist production that destroys natural habitats, consumes land and wildlife, trades commodities around the globe, and moves people at a speed unprecedented in history. The gist of this analysis is the promise of a remedy that not only treats symptoms, but eradicates the root causes of the evil. So let's start our conversation with some very basic questions, namely, what kind of a crisis is the coronavirus pandemic? Is it an endogenous or an exogenous crisis? Is it a natural or a socially induced disaster? According to some of the political and academic commentators, the outbreak of the pandemic is just another random natural disaster. The crisis would then be contingent and exogenous, bad luck, so to say, but no reason why we couldn't be able to get back to normal after overcoming this crisis. Others argue that the crisis is endogenous, self-made. According to this position, the crisis reveals a structural dysfunctionality of our social and economical order. And the crisis is itself a result of this dysfunctionality. Thus, getting back to normal would be the worst case. So, Andreas, what kind of crisis do you think we are facing?
Well, I'm all on the side of the endogenous explanation here. Nowadays, there are quite few natural disasters that aren't somehow produced by social developments, or that at least carry their imprint. I mean, there are still earthquakes and other natural disasters that have in their drivers little to do with human impacts. But when it comes to emerging infectious diseases such as this one, or to climate disasters that we have already seen a fair share of this year, as in previous years, we had the wildfires in Australia, we have the locust crisis in East Africa, and lots of smoldering crises caused by global heating around the world. None of these disasters can be perceived as exogenous any longer. They are thoroughly created by our social systems and the way they interact with natural systems. When it comes to climate disasters, such as the wildfire disaster in Australia, for instance, people were fairly quick to make the link to the underlying trend of global heating. But when it comes to COVID-19, people, at least this is my perception, tend to see this disaster as a bolt out of the blue, an act of God, or as you say, put it, a case of bad luck, an exogenous shock that has just, boom, hit us like any other plague in medical history. This is just, this happens with a certain frequency, there's nothing that we can do about it. It's like an asteroid hitting a planet. It's just how nature works, how it operates, and we just have to adapt to deal with it and create good medical systems or whatever.
Maybe you could elaborate a bit more on the connection between, which is already my second question. So how are the Corona crisis, the climate crisis, and the ecological crisis in general connected? Are those parallel crises, each having its own dynamics? Are we facing a multiple crisis with aspects that relate to each other, even causally, or even causally connected? So in other words, is the Corona pandemic, according to your position, a result of the ecological crisis in general, a result of climate crisis, a bit more special? So how are those connected?
This is a very broad and complex problem. I would not say that this crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic is a result of the climate crisis. I mean, there might hypothetically be some causal links. I can come back to that, but I don't think we can, with any support from the science so far, say that global heating is a factor driving this pandemic as such. But it's beyond doubt, in my reading of the scientific literature, that this particular pandemic is one more symptom of a trend, which is the production of emerging infectious diseases at a higher rate. So we see those diseases striking more frequently than ever before in recent decades. I won't enumerate all of them, but we've had the Nipah virus, the Ebola, the various outbreaks of Ebola viruses. We've had the first coronavirus pandemic, the SARS one, then there was MERS, and a lot of other diseases of this kind. And the science is pretty clear in that this trend, of which the ongoing pandemic is one symptom or one effect or one instance, this trend has a fundamental general driver, which is the increased domination of the human economy over wild nature. And through this domination, we come into contact with pathogens that circulate naturally in wild nature. As long as we don't come into contact with the reservoirs where those pathogens exist and circulate, we don't contract those diseases. But when we impose various kind of economic activities on those habitats where the pathogens circulate, we inevitably come into contact with them and open up our human populations and economies. We expose ourselves to them.
How have people not been in contact with wild nature? I mean,
yeah, well,
I'm a bit naive, but I would assume that people in former centuries have been even more in touch with wild nature, or living together with animals anyway. But also, I mean, couldn't you argue that living in big cities means that we are more remote from whatever might even resemble wild nature?
This is a very contradictory thing. That when people were hunter and gatherers, obviously they lived all over wild nature. There was no opposite to wild nature. But for a pandemic to kick off, you have to be more than just an isolated band of hunters roaming through a forest or savanna or whatever. You have to have an economic infrastructure that allows for those pathogens to transmit very rapidly. That's how the encounter with a pathogen is transformed into a pandemic, that you have some kind of infrastructure or logistical system that allows for extremely rapid transmission into a large human population. That's the role that aviation has played in this pandemic. It's a contradictory movement in that we in big cities live as though we were cut off from wild habitats, but this level of consumption that we have in cities in advanced capitalist countries is predicated on a continuous conquest and subsumption of wild habitats, because the commodities that are pulled into our cities come from forests that have been felled throughout the tropical regions.
But just to sum it up, I mean, the relation between those factors. So it is like the ecological crisis broadly conceived of that will lead to, on the one side, I mean, according to your thesis, will produce climate change on the one side, the tendency to produce diseases and pandemics on the other. So they are just like two aspects of the ecological crisis in general, not causally related to each other, but there might be, let's say, elective affinities and some kind of connections and interdependencies between those.
Let me just say that I think there are causal links that make these two crisis tendencies intertwined. So, for instance, if deforestation is the main driver of the rise in emerging infectious diseases, it is the second most important driver of anthropogenic climate change. So clearly there's a link there. Our global transport system based on mass aviation to a large extent is the main transmission, the main driver of the transmission of a pandemic. It's also a problem in that it burns so much oil.
Okay, so my next question would be where capitalism comes into play. What is it exactly that the pandemic reveals about capitalist societies, the capitalist mode of production, the capitalist way of life, our social, political, and economical order that is shaped by capitalism?
Capitalism is the general medium, social medium of our lives. And that means that it's there in the genesis of this disease and it's there in the effects. I mean, when you see rich people being able to self-isolate in very luxurious mansions in the British countryside, while health workers are left without decent protective equipment, you see the imprints of capitalism there in how the disease plays out. But I also think that you can detect the logic of capitalism in the very production of these kind of diseases. And to put it on the most general and abstract level, I think that the fundamental problem here is that capitalism has to grow all the time, and that means that it increases its material throughput and has to subsume more and more of wild nature and convert rainforests or wild animals into commodities that can be sold on the market. This is the most basic logic of capitalism and how it operates. And that in itself means that you produce precisely the problem of dominating wild nature and inevitably as an accidental byproduct also exposing human populations to the pathogens that exist naturally in wild nature. And this is the most general explanation, I would say. But then you can go much more into the particular details. So if you, for instance, look at the wet markets in China that have exploded in the past 2 decades or since the 1990s, this clearly has something to do with China's opening up to global capitalism around the millennium, where those wet markets all of a sudden, because of the open, globalized, free trade, got access to wild habitats around Southeast Asia and could pull in everything from pangolins to bamboo rats to bats to all sorts of exotic animals from those habitats and draw them into circulation in those wet markets. And that conforms with the logic of capital, that you convert things without exchange value as a pangolin in the wild into a commodity that can be sold and you can make profit from it. That's what capitalism has always been about. And these wet markets really have exploded at the time of China's full integration into globalized capitalism. And I don't think you can understand them without the rise in wealth and conspicuous consumption that has emerged in China. And as I argue, is not anything intrinsically Chinese, but is very... I mean, anyone who's seen the Netflix documentary Tiger King knows that this is something that happens in the US as well, where very wealthy people like to flaunt their affluence by showing up the wild animals that they own.
This is specific for capitalism, not just for, let's say, industrialism, a certain kind of marketization, consumer culture, and so on. So for you, this would be specifically linked to a certain kind of accumulation of capital and the growth dynamic that stems from this, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, I think the growth, the compulsion to grow and to subsume wild nature is something that is specific to the logic of capitalism. And I think you can historically demonstrate when and where it emerged. And I believe it did so in Britain when capitalist property relations first took hold of agriculture in that country in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries and onwards. And then you had the development of these ideas that you have to improve nature. I quote John Locke in this little book, but there's, I mean, this ties in with another much bigger historical project that I'm working on. But the idea that you can't leave wild nature to itself, but you have to tame it and turn it into profit. That's an idea that emerges at a very specific historical stage. You can find other kinds of domination of wild nature, obviously, already in ancient Egypt, in ancient Rome. But the idea that you subsume nature to turn nature and to modify processes in nature, including how to grow food and things like that, so as to yield a profit, and thereby have an increase also in productivity and a process of self-sustaining growth. That, I believe, is very particular to capitalism. Clearly, this is difficult to distinguish from modernity or from industrialism, which are very, very deeply tied up with capitalism. But I do think that the trend over the past decades, and it's actually, I mean, it's quite a recent trend. It's from the 1970s and after of this rapid rise in emerging infectious diseases. I would have difficulty seeing how you could explain that with features inherent to modernity as such, rather than to a particular phase of very predatory, rapacious, aggressive capital accumulation that comes with this stage of globalization. Likewise, if you look at China, I don't think what's new in China of the past decades is its modernity or its industrialism, but precisely its full integration into global capitalism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason I brought the question about the specificity of capitalism in is that you might imagine an industrial, socialist, communist even society, and it's an maybe not so open question how this kind of society will deal with the ecological question.
Let me just say that's a very important point. And if you look at the way that the Stalinist states operated, and if we focus on the Soviet Union, clearly after when the first 5-year plan got going and industrialization kicked off in the Soviet Union, you had a very similar process of self-sustaining growth with extremely violent domination of nature in the Soviet Union. So you could make the argument that it's not capitalism as such, it's growth. It's the process of constant growth. But I do believe that in our societies as they look now, the driver of that growth is capital accumulation. We don't live in Stalinist societies. So, but if we were to live in Stalinist societies, we might have had similar problems. Yes.
And last question with respect to capitalism, and then we will switch over to the alternatives. Do you think that capitalism does have the resources to overcome those crises? And if not, so why not? Because again, and because there are people who would say, yeah, maybe capitalism has produced those crises, maybe it has created the ecological disaster, but it also has the means to solve the problem because of its like immense ability to adapt, immense ability to come up with new solutions, and so on and so on. So why does it not have resources to overcome its self-made crisis?
Yeah, well, so I guess there are two questions here. One is, can capitalism as a mode of production survive those crises and go on prospering, on the one hand? The other is, does capitalism allow people in general to adapt to those crises? If we focus on the first one, this is a question that I think I struggle with a little bit in this manuscript. The question of whether crises such as this pandemic and other potential future pandemics and climate disasters can continue to escalate without at some point tearing capitalism apart. So my point of view, as you know, has been for some time that the climate crisis so far has been entirely compatible with capitalist boom, golden age. Maybe not golden age, but I mean high rates of profit and generally a reasonably successful process of capital accumulation around the world. It has not been the case, as some have argued, that global heating so far causes serious pressures on profits and creates crisis for capitalism as a mode of production. But this pandemic appears to have created one of the greatest economic crises in the history of capitalism. And we're just a few months into it, so we don't know how it will play out. But it's fascinating to see that a problem that I consider to be fundamentally ecological actually curves back on capital accumulation itself and initiates one of the one of the largest, if not the largest, suspension of normal capital accumulation in modern history. Now, all of this is premised on the expectation that all these emergency measures, these lockdowns and limitations on business as usual will come to an end, and we will revert back to something like normal again. And that might very well happen. And then clearly capitalism would have survived this pandemic. Sure. And that might be the likeliest scenario. But if we have a situation where these pandemics happen again, I mean, there's one leading expert on zoonotic diseases who said the other month that we're now on a trajectory where we'll see events like this happening every third year. I mean, just imagine that he's right. We don't know, but imagine that he's right, and we'll have viruses spreading like this every third year in the next decade or two. And imagine that capitalist states feel compelled for one reason or another to deal with those pandemics like it has dealt with this one. What will happen to capitalism then? Well, I don't know, but presumably we'd be moving into some version of capitalism where you have much more public control and state interference into how markets operate. Because that's the trend that we've been seeing during this treatment of the pandemic or this period. If this keeps on happening, we don't know where if capitalism as we know it will fundamentally be transformed. Possibly. I mean that's a matter for speculation. I don't think that, I mean, as I write, Marxists have had a fondness for predicting the imminent end of capitalism, and I definitely don't want to do that. I mean, some talk about Corona-Capitalism, that we're already on the way out of capitalism or just neoliberalism. And my takeaway from the last financial crisis and other economic crises in recent history is that you should never underestimate the ability of capitalism to rebound and come back stronger again. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It might very well happen in this case.
Let's talk about desirable, emancipatory, whatever transformations or modes of social change. So if fossil capitalism is the problem, what is the solution? What is the solution according to your project. Some keywords that show up in the manuscript: an ecological Leninism, wartime communism. Those keywords might be a bit frightening to some of us, so I would just want you to elaborate on what kind of measures you suggest. What is it that you have in mind with an ecological Leninism and the kind of life that we would lead under wartime communism?
Yeah.
What's the solution, basically?
Yeah. So I mean, these terms are a little bit intentionally provocative, but
of course, this is why I cite them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, they're there, and I'm not. Yeah, I'll try to explain what I mean with those terms. But let me just first say that the general argument in the book is that what we've seen over the past few months are states taking very intrusive measures into people's lives to deal with the symptoms of the crisis. And these measures have been quite unpleasant, I have to say. I mean, living under lockdown in Berlin wasn't that fun. And I think most people share that experience. Now, states have taken these kind of measures to deal with the symptoms. And my underlying argument is that if we never deal with the drivers of those pandemics and of climate disasters, we'll just find ourselves in one crisis of this kind after another. That's the idea of the chronic emergency. That will stumble from one disaster into the next, as we have been doing over the past couple of years, and I think that's the near future we're looking at, unless, or sooner or later, there will have to be a shift where states apply some of these measures to the drivers themselves. And that doesn't mean locking up people in their homes. That does not mean having the kind of repressive measures that we've had during the lockdowns. But it does mean some control measures to deal with the kind of production and consumption that cause these crises. And if we first talk about the climate crisis, I just throw out one demand that others have been throwing out recently as well, and that is to nationalize all companies that produce fossil fuels and terminate their fossil fuel production and instead convert these companies into organizations for drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Instead of belching it out, drawing it down. And if we're going to reduce emissions by something like 8% per year, that scientists tell us will be necessary if we're not going to breach the 1.5 degree threshold, which is now more or less out of reach, and we're then kicking the can down the road. And if we're looking at limiting global heating to 2 degrees or 3 degrees in a decade or two, we'll probably have to cut emissions by even more. So if we envision an economy that cuts emissions by something like 10% year on year on year until we reach zero, that, and everyone knows this because it's implicit in the whole discourse, that means that states exercise a lot of planning of the economies. If you want to deal with the drivers of zoonotic diseases, then deforestation is the key. And deforestation is nowadays largely driven by consumption in the global north. So my suggestion, which is deliberately utopian, because obviously I don't see this happening anytime soon, is that states should make inventories or audits or for a start, map what supply chains and trade flows into their countries cause deforestation in the tropics, and then deal with those flows and reorient them. So, for instance, we should start very simply by banning import of meat from the tropics. And meat, the production of meat in the tropics is a key driver of deforestation there, and thereby of zoonotic spillover and emerging infectious diseases. And I don't think I mean, if we can lock up people inside their houses for a certain period of time, surely we can say to people that you can't eat beef from Brazil any longer, because that's part of what's driving the diseases. And I don't think that even would be a big sacrifice to make, to tell people to cease consuming meat from Brazil. I mean, their health would even benefit from it. But so I throw out a lot of more or less utopian demands that I think would go some way to address the causal drivers of these problems. And I don't think you can deal with those emergencies without using the state. So the tradition that I think would be most useful here is the Leninist one, which has its fair share of problems that I recognize too. But the central idea of an ecological Leninism would be to kind of copy the original move of Lenin during the First World War, when he said, and others, obviously, like Rosa Luxemburg, that this war is a catastrophe that emerges out of imperialist capitalism. So what we should do is we should transform this crisis of symptoms, if you like, into a crisis of the drivers and turn the war into a blow against capitalism itself.
Just in order to get a clearer picture about the changes for our form of life and how we should imagine life under wartime communism, ecological Leninism, and your suggestions. I mean, you mentioned that, banning import of meat from the tropics wouldn't even affect our lives that much, would even be better for our health and so on. But of course, there are different opinions on that, and this somehow rings the bells. Like, there are people who would say this is, at least paternalistic, if not authoritarian. Talking about a planned economy, who plans? Who knows what people need, what they should be provided with? Who does the planning, and who decides upon real, true needs? So this has been a problem for, any kind of socialist, communist, whatever utopia. So I want to go a bit deeper into this, just in order to get a clear picture of what you have in mind. Is this something like a radical abstinence in the face of an apocalyptic situation, or of an ongoing and permanent state of emergency? Would you allow for some kind of luxuries? What about chocolate? You mentioned chocolate several times, and I'm sure you will make a lot of enemies by banning chocolate from our lives. So what kind of, is it radical abstinence? Would we still be able to travel? Would we still be able to sustain our long distance friendships or even relationships? What kind of change would this mean?
I don't envision ecological Leninism as a condition of life, or as how do we live under ecological Leninism. It's an idea of, it's a proposal about how to think strategically about those crises. And the crux of it is that unless we turn those crises of symptoms into crises of the drivers, we'll just find ourselves in those emergencies again and again and again. So the way out is to make the original Leninist move of targeting the drivers of the problem. Now, does that mean that we're going to have to practice generalized abstinence and submit to a totalitarian state? Hopefully not. Let me just give an example of what I consider to be a very positive and hopeful step in the right direction. And that's the announcement that came just a few days ago that large sections of inner city London will be turned car-free on a permanent basis when the lockdown now ceases. This is the kind of step that needs to be taken, but on a much larger scale. And what this entails is that the mayor, that is essentially the state apparatus, draws a limit and says you cannot drive on the streets. These streets are only for bicycles and for pedestrians. And that's an infringement on a certain kind of freedom, namely the freedom to take your car wherever you like, right? And it's the state going in and drawing a line and saying that you can't do this here in this space. This space we now leave on a permanent basis to people bicycling and walking. And I'm all in favor of that. And that's precisely the kind of interference into the spheres of private consumption that I think we need. Is this undemocratic? Well, I don't think so. He's obviously an elected mayor. And I think that he can gather a lot of popular support also for this kind of infringement in private consumption. And I think one of the interesting lessons of the pandemic, as it has played out in Europe at least, is that public interferences in markets do not necessarily translate into loss of political support, but it can actually be exactly the other way around, that people are prepared to make certain sacrifices if they have politicians who make a convincing case that we're facing an emergency and need to deal with it. I mean, Angela Merkel is gaining in popular support by quite forceful measures.
So it would be to regain democratic control over the economy.
Yes.
In your utopian vision, the state of emergency is somehow a permanent state of emergency. I mean, people here are already they're fed up with the state of emergency already. And of course, and obviously this is something that if you turn this into a permanent state, then things will be different. And again, coming back to the idea of a planned economy, this might be part of what it means to regain control with respect to the economy, but also there are all those problems that I already mentioned. Who is to decide upon?
Sure. There are lots of big problems here, but let me just clarify that I'm not suggesting that this kind of lockdown should be turned into a permanent condition. Absolutely not. To the contrary, the only way to ensure that it's not the permanent condition, in the sense that we're not facing these extreme crises again and again and again and again, is to have another kind of emergency situation where you deal with the drivers instead. That means we have to embark on a transition. That's a transitional period we're talking about. A transition, most importantly, away from fossil fuels. And let me just say that I don't think that this necessarily implies a completely planned economy. But I do think that it implies certain kinds of state interventions into how the economy currently operates. So, for instance, if we consider, just imagine that ExxonMobil and Shell would be nationalized tomorrow, and the Dutch and the American and British governments would close down fossil fuel production. By the way, these two companies both intend to increase oil production by some 30% in the next decade, although these were based on the investment plans before this pandemic struck, so it might have changed a little bit by now. Anyway, these are companies that work as much as they can to, de facto burn the planet. That's what they are doing. They're on the loose. I consider them to be criminal entities, and they should be taken under public control and turned into their opposite. Would that be a reduction in democracy or an expansion of democracy? Well, I would think it would be a massive expansion of democracy if you abolished what is de facto a kind of dictatorship over the fate of the earth exercised by fossil capital, and take those companies under democratic control and turn them into something completely different. So I think the transitional period away from fossil economy to a non-fossil economy is conceivable as a project of expansion of democratic control ultimately over the fate of the planet. That does not imply, I think, any kind of radical universalized abstinence, as in we have to forego all forms of luxury. But yes, I do think that certain kinds of consumption will need to be curtailed. I'm not saying these things because I believe that there is a kind of innate value in abstinence or living frugally or anything like that. And I would personally be able to fly a lot if we could. But there are material constraints in the world, and those constraints are narrowing in on us. And that means that at some point we have to face up to them. And as societies start to discuss if our levels of consumption in our parts of the world are sustainable. I don't think they are.
I want to go a bit deeper into the democracy question. One last question about democracy. So if I understood you rightly, your idea means that this is about democracy exactly because we are going to, the realm in which we are even able to make decisions will be expanded. Like, let's make decisions about certain economical issues that affect at least the ecology. But do you also have ideas about what kind of democracy, like radical democracy, council democracy? I mean, how to organize the kind of participation and how to enable the kind of participation that you have in mind?
I don't know if I have any good answers to this, but let me just say this: the logic of the argument I'm outlining is that as states currently operate in our part of the world, and maybe in all of the world, it's quite unlikely that they, of their own accord, of their own initiative, would ever take on these demands and turn against the drivers. So in the case of the climate crisis, it's much easier to see them going for something like solar geoengineering. So my argument is that if we're ever going to make governments take on the fossil fuel companies or the drivers of deforestation or anything like that, it will happen after pressure from below. So popular democratic pressure in all its forms, be it electoral campaigns for parties like Labour, as it was until a few months ago, or for Bernie Sanders or whatever it is, all the way to mass sabotage, will be essential to get states to move in this direction. So that means that any kind of transition, if it's ever going to happen, will have to rely on a groundswell of popular mobilization. We saw some of that last year when the climate movement reached its all-time peak in the world so far. All of that just came to a total end with the outbreak of this pandemic, which is one of its great political disasters. But when the lockdown eases, hopefully the climate movement can come back on track, and the momentum can be regained, although it will probably take some time for it to return to the levels we saw last year. But I mean, we have to think about those things as stemming from popular pressure from below.
There are a lot of people who would say, especially with respect to the ecological question, some kind of authoritarianism would be so much more effective. I mean, evoking examples from, let's say, China and so on. Would you think that democracy is not only like more desirable, so that we would have to weigh up between like authoritarianism might be more effective, but still some want to have a democracy. But is there a way in which to conceive of democratic procedures as even being more effective or functional in order to reach your goals?
Yes. For instance, if you look at a state like China that still owns the big coal and oil companies in that country that are clearly absolutely crucial to the climate crisis. So the Chinese state already owns those companies and could, in that sense, very easily give different directives to these companies and just say to them, from next year, you stop producing coal and oil and you become negative emissions technologies operators instead, and you draw down carbon dioxide. Yes. So in a sense, an authoritarian state like China is better positioned to do that. But on the other hand, precisely because it is an authoritarian state, it is not susceptible to popular pressure in a way like, for instance, the German state is. So the debate around coal that you've had in Germany or in recent years is a direct result of popular mobilization around the coal mines with Ende Gelände and all of these things. And that's why you had that's why coal became an issue in Germany in the first place. That hasn't happened so far in China, presumably because the ability to mobilize out in the open around something like coal isn't as large as in a democratic country. Does that also mean that a democratic country is more efficient? Well, yeah, I mean, I think I mean, I guess at least some would argue that this pandemic has showed that the states that have been most successful are the ones that have a reasonably well-functioning contract with their populations that's based on democracy and a level of trust. And I guess that's what you can see perhaps both in Germany and in Sweden, although they've taken very different approaches to the crisis in terms of actual measures for combating it. But both have reasonably well-functioning democratic institutions that have turned out to be also, again, reasonably efficient. A much weaker democracy like the United States has been, or Brazil for that matter, has been extremely inefficient in dealing with the crisis. So I think you have a point that democracy and efficiency can certainly go together.
Okay, so our time's up now. It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming, or not coming, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye.
Likewise. Thank you.